Hey, everybody out there in the Survival Mom Bootcamp land. Welcome. Today we have a really timely topic, and it's about how to use do-it-yourself yeast to bake bread. And I'm here a couple minutes early. We're supposed to start at about the top of the hour. So I'm here about 3 minutes early, and we really will start at the top of the hour. But I wanted to just jump in and make sure my video, my camera, my audio, and everything else is working. I may or may not see your questions or comments because right now I am using a software called StreamYard, which I actually really like. I like it better than the Facebook Live option. So I believe you might have to log into StreamYard if you want me to see your comments right away. Otherwise, I'll try to go back and forth between here and the Facebook group. So hello, everybody. And if you are watching this, my guess is that you have been wondering, what's the big deal about making your own homemade yeast? And what even is homemade yeast? But then also, what do you do with it once you have your jar or your container of starter? And so that is what we're going to be covering today. If you want to jot down any instructions, I'm going to start by showing you how to proof yeast. And for that, you will need yeast, dry yeast, whether it's in a packet, a jar, or another container. You're going to need a little bit of sugar. I have about a teaspoon here. And you're going to be needing warm water, which I'll have about a half cup or so of warm water. I don't think I measured mine. I think that's warm enough. It's been sitting here for a minute or two. And we will start by proofing our yeast, or proofing our yeast. And then I have a couple of different ways for you to move on from there. So if we're just getting acquainted, I'm Lisa Bedford. I am the founder of the Survival Mom website, Survival Mom courses, Survival Mom Sisterhood membership, as well as the bootcamp group and a few other places on social media. So it looks like we are almost at the top of the hour, but until then, I don't want to give away any of my my big secrets, so to speak. Let me tell you how I ended up figuring out how to make homemade yeast, what that means, and then how we got to the place where we are today in this Facebook Live event, where we're going to be talking about what do you do once you have that yeast. And that really was kind of like the $40,000 question that most people had. So if you kind of go back in your memory, along with me, to March, April, May, June of 2020. And that's when much of the country, much of the world was all locked down in quarantine. And people were noticing shortages of toilet paper and Purell hand sanitizer. And then pretty soon people were researching, how do I make my own hand sanitizer? And before you knew it, there were shortages of those ingredients. And stores started showing all kinds of shortages. But as people were in their homes, interesting things started to happen. They began bird watching. They began learning how to knit. They really got into baking. And part of the baking, as they soon discovered, was how to get their hands on yeast. And just as the Purell hand sanitizer was disappearing from the shelves, and then the ingredients, the alcohol and aloe vera or whatever, was also disappearing, yeast was disappearing. And people were baking like crazy. And so they began researching how to make yeast. How do I make yeast? And I happened to have an article on my blog from, it was 2 or 3 years ago that it was posted, maybe even longer, How to Make Yeast. That was the title. And so I started noticing a crazy amount of traffic on an article, How to Make Yeast. And I personally am not that much of a baker. And so I was asking people, well, what's this deal about making yeast? And I started learning that there was a shortage of yeast in the grocery stores. So when you look up an article on how to make yeast, you will find that the method is generally to take some kind of a fruit. It could be apples, chopped apples, it could be raisins, and even potatoes. You can take diced potatoes. And on the outer skin of those foods is already wild yeast. And you put that in a container with some water. Um, there are directions in my article, and then you just set it somewhere warmish, and gradually that yeast will bloom. It will also begin to capture wild yeast that's just in the air. There is wild yeast all around us. So once you have that that little concoction in a jar or in a container, then you can start feeding the yeast. And you feed the yeast by adding an amount of flour and the same amount of water every day. And you mix it up really well. Before you know it, you have starter. Now, here is where it got a little bit confusing because a lot of people would get in touch with me and say, I don't want to make sourdough. I have starter. I just want to make bread. And that kind of is where the whole process fell apart. What do you do once you have the starter? So we're going to now kind of go through some steps, and I'll explain to you the easiest way of using your starter. All right. So we're going to start by proofing your yeast. And about 20 minutes ago or so, I actually did this here at my house, and I'm going to show you in a minute how I did this. But this is proofed yeast. And you can tell just by the way that it has mounted up on the top that this yeast is very active. It's ready to be used in whatever kind of recipe calls for yeast. Very, very simple to use or to proof the yeast. And the reason I recommend doing this is just to make sure that if you're starting out with actual yeast, that it's going to activate. So you will take an amount of warm water. It doesn't have to be hot. Take your warm water, add about a teaspoon of sugar. I've also seen this done with honey, and then a couple teaspoons of yeast. Now, the reason I am saying to proof your yeast is that a lot of times, I'm adding about a little over 2 teaspoons or so. I'm going to mix it. A lot of times when you look at a container of yeast, there will be an expiration date on the bottom. Whether it's an expiry date or it is a best by or sell by date, you look at that. Let me see if this one, I can find one for this jar. I'm sure it's there. Yeah, it's stamped right on top. When you find that, a lot of times, the rule of thumb is, well, yeast lasts about a year in a cool, dark, dry location. And you'll notice this jar is dark, which is protecting the yeast inside. So light can and does deteriorate food. So we're all good there. But I have to tell you something. I have actually used yeast that was 10 years old. No joke. I had purchased yeast by the pound years ago. And when the time came for me to throw it out, my husband and I, we were kind of clearing out some of the food storage pantry. And he said, well, what do you want to do with this yeast? And I said, well, why don't we just try it before we throw out it was a couple of pounds in one package. It was a lot of yeast. Well, sure enough, that yeast, we proofed the yeast, it bubbled up, and we've actually made bread out of 10-year-old yeast. So that's why I tell you, before you throw away yeast, make sure you proof it first. So while I have this here, and when you do this yourself, you can actually just watch, and you're going to see little bubbles begin to pop up. And before you know it, you're going to have a nice bubbly mound, just like this, and you'll know for sure you have good yeast. But what if you don't have yeast? Well, a couple of things. One, last month, one of my members of Survival Mom Sisterhood posed the question, what if you have a very limited amount of yeast? There's a yeast shortage, but you have some yeast, but this is all the yeast I have. What can you do? Well, you can begin by proofing that yeast. You only need a couple teaspoons, you're not going to waste much of it. And once you see that, yes, that yeast is active, you can use it right then and there as a starter. So if I wanted to, and I might take this proven yeast or what is actually developing here, and I'm beginning to start getting bubbles. Unfortunately, my camera can't really, I wonder if I can move my camera to show you. Let me let it bubble up for another minute or so. But what you can do is just stir the yeast and then add about a 1/4 cup of flour. You can use whole wheat. You can grind wheat to make, freshly ground flour, or you could use all-purpose flour, bread flour. You're going to use a quarter cup of the flour, a quarter cup of water, and mix it really well. You will do that the next day and the next day and the next day. And soon you're going to have a container. We've had this starter now for a few weeks, and this is our starter. We keep it in the microwave just because we don't need the cold air from the air conditioning blowing on it. But we have made multiple loaves of bread from that starter. And that starter began just with proof yeast. So, number one, you can get started making a starter, a yeast starter with actual yeast. And that is an easy way of just getting started. So if there ever is another yeast shortage, just know that you can get your starter going with 2 teaspoons of yeast. Feed it every day, and then here is the next step. The next step, whether your starter is one of the homemade recipes where you're starting with raisins, or you're starting with chopped up apples, chopped up potatoes, there are a number of different ways to get that starter going. Once you see the bubbles, you add an equal amount of flour and water stirred every day until you have a starter that looks like it's alive. It's going to actually maybe overflow the container. It's a very, very happy starter. Well, here is what worked for us. And that is to start out by just finding a simple sourdough bread recipe. Easy, easy peasy. And the reason that I am saying to get started with that is because a sourdough bread recipe already has a measurement for the starter. And what you have, whether it's a jar or a plastic container or whatever, what you have is a starter. It's yeast, regardless of whether you started it with fruit, chopped up potatoes, or yeast like I just demonstrated. So if you begin with the starter and a simple sourdough recipe, you're going to find that that bread is not going to be all that sour. It takes some time for the sourness to develop. There are different techniques for getting a starter to taste more sour. But when we began using the starter that I just showed you, our bread was just, it was a really tasty loaf, even though it was a sourdough recipe. Now, I'm going to put a pause button right here because there is one more part of our experiment that we have not tried yet, and that is to use our starter in a bread recipe, the kind that just you put in a loaf pan and you slice it up. But what we're going to do is find a simple bread recipe, and we're going to start with the same amount of grams that a sourdough bread recipe calls for. So if you have the starter, if you've been wondering, I was reading all about how to make yeast, but now what do I do? Just find a simple sourdough bread recipe and look to see how many grams it requires. And by the way, when you're using grams, it is much, much more accurate than saying a half a cup or a quarter cup, because with the gram, it's just, a very precise number on your kitchen scale. So if you don't have a kitchen scale, now would be a good time, to buy one for 15 bucks or something. So that in a nutshell is how you go about using your DIY or your homemade yeast. You get something going, whether it's with the fruit in the warm water or using a small amount of yeast to get your starter going. You feed the starter on a regular basis. We are using a quarter cup of flour and a quarter cup of water every day, but I've also seen people use a half a cup or even a full cup of flour and a full cup of water. Get that going. Now, if you ever are thinking, oh, I'm up to my ears in bread, or we're trying to eat lower carb, what do I do now that I have this starter going and I love the starter, but we've got to watch our bread intake? You just put this in a refrigerator with a lid on it. Keep it in your refrigerator, and when you're ready to use it, pull it out of the fridge, let it come to room temperature, feed it with flour and water. It's going to start bubbling up again in a few hours, and then it's going to be ready to go. So I hope that helps. When we do, which is going to be in the next couple of days as I'm recording this in late July 2022, we'll find a regular bread recipe, and we will give it a try with the starter using grams. Now, before I sign off, here is the yeast that I proofed, and you can see that this yeast is a happy yeast. And again, I don't need a ton of yeast to get my starter going. 2 teaspoons is all I put in here. So if I want to turn this into starter right now, I'll add a quarter, half cup of flour, a quarter, half cup, equal amounts of water, stir it really well, feed it every day. And before you know it, you're going to have a bubbly starter that's ready to use. I hope this helps. It was a lot. I had lots and lots of questions. How on earth do I actually use the starter that I made, the homemade yeast? And there is your answer. Okay. If you have questions about this, post it wherever you're watching this. And what I will do is answer your questions. And then I'm hoping in the next day or two, we'll use this to make just a plain bread recipe. And I'll get back with you and I'll let you know the recipe and the amount of the starter, and I'll show you our results. All right. I hope that this helped. And it's been a pleasure spending this time with you. Bye-bye.